Hi, Phil Priestley here with another video, and we're going to be talking about the important topic of hate crime. Here's what you need to know. Most things in law, and particularly in criminal law, have a very precisely worded definition. So let's begin by looking at that definition of hate crime as it's been agreed between the Crown Prosecution Service, who are the lawyers who prosecute criminal offences, and the police. The hate crime definition is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based upon a person's disability or perceived disability, race or perceived race, religion or perceived religion, their sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or transgender identity or perceived transgender identity. There are several things going on within this definition, guys, and we need to break it into smaller pieces so that we can really understand it more clearly. All crime can be a hate crime. But what makes the difference is the state of mind of the person committing the offence and why they did it in the first place. Now, we can't climb inside their head, so we have to make a decision on what their motive was for ourselves. They might tell us, they might not. So it can be any crime. And that definition around motive can come from either the victim or, more broadly, any other person who perceives it to be motivated by a particular type of hostility or prejudice. We've been given several specific categories here. There are 5 actually. Disability, race, religion, sexual orientation, and transgender identity. So, if an offender commits a crime, and they do it because they don't like either someone specifically or a group more broadly, on the basis of one of those things, we're in hate crime territory. What this also means is that there are 2 categories of hate crime effectively. Those that are committed broadly against groups of people, and those that are committed when an individual is targeted. So, for example, if a criminal decides to commit an act of vandalism in a public park, and they spray paint a message all over a wall, that crime is criminal damage. If the offender has targeted that park because they know that it is used particularly by Polish families and groups, and they wanted to send a hostile message to Eastern European people generally, so that the graffiti says "Poles go home," and it has a Nazi or a far-right logo on the message, now we're into hate crime. This is the first type of hate crime, a crime that doesn't target a specific individual but seeks to intimidate a community. If the offender knew that a particular person went to that park and wanted to target that specific individual because they believed they were Polish, we're in the second category of hate crime. They might even follow them home and commit damages there. It targets a specific person very directly, and it presumes something about them, that they're Polish. The fact that this person is perceived to be Polish, and it turns out that they're not Polish, doesn't matter. anyone can see that this is absolutely and very definitely a hate crime. Very sadly, we know that hate crime has been climbing, but we also know that for a number of years and even today, that hate crime is underreported. This means that victims aren't coming forward every time that it happens. They suffer in silence. So while hate crime figures are climbing, we're kind of glad to see that more people are showing confidence in the police by reporting matters so that some form of positive action can be taken. Of course, we want hate crime to fall in real terms, but we want it to fall for real, not just on paper. Two recent events have definitely had an effect on hate crime. One is the Brexit EU referendum, and immediately after that vote in 2016, there was a real spike in hate crime which targeted EU immigrants and specifically Eastern European communities. One particular offence that I remember very clearly was a man who went down a particular street putting pre-printed messages under windscreen wipers on cars telling people to get out of the country if they weren't born in the UK. The second event that's had a real impact on hate crime has been the COVID-19 pandemic. In the early stages of the pandemic, particular different countries were seen to be swept by the pandemic before it reached the UK. Consequently, reporting on this phenomenon caused a backlash against different races and people who were perceived to be of such races. I recall quite clearly when Italy was battling with particularly high rates of infection and transmission, and that people from the Italian communities in the UK were being treated with prejudice by some people as a consequence. Chinese communities have suffered racial abuse because of the pandemic and due to a number of irresponsible statements calling it the China flu and the Chinese virus, as well as certain political commentators who made statements demanding that the Chinese people and their government should be forced to pay reparations for causing the COVID-19 pandemic. Hate crime becomes particularly awful when a specific individual or family gets targeted. Let's have a look at disability discrimination, for example, and hate crime targeted at disabled people. Being disabled is a very difficult thing to have to live with. Having to overcome the challenges of a disability and then overcome the prejudice that surrounds your disability is just unnecessary. It's unfair and it's horrible. Statistically, disabled people are more likely to suffer with financial hardship and poverty. They are less likely to be able to control the choices about where they live, for example, and they're less likely to be able to afford an advocate to work for them, or have the money to repair damages when their home is targeted. While people generally think about disabled people in terms of the blind, or people who are restricted to wheelchairs, or people with obvious mental impairment who are incapable of independent living, there are invisible disabilities such as autism, multiple sclerosis, and fibromyalgia, which can involve people having good days and bad days with their conditions. Sometimes they're more able to get out and about, and sometimes they can't leave the house. A wave of publicity and media against benefits claimants have made people in receipt of benefits and allowances far more likely to be targeted with hatred. People who have obvious and permanent impairment are less likely to receive this type of hostility, but people with hidden disabilities and conditions of a relapsing and remitting nature have definitely had to cope with hate crime on a disproportionate scale and often have to suffer with feelings of guilt on the days that they do feel a little bit more able. Hate crime also includes the categories of hatred and hostility towards perceived sexuality, and more recently has adopted the issue of trans rights too. Homophobia is literally defined as an irrational fear of same-sex relationships, whether that is directed against gay men, lesbian women, or bisexual people of any gender. It has long been a problem. Until recently, homophobic insults and slurs were deemed to be socially acceptable. And even today, sometimes people use the reference, "that's gay," to describe something that they think is inferior or rubbish. As with disability and race, a person has no choice on their sexuality. We don't get to select a preference towards who we fall in love with or who we're attracted towards sexually. Many people realise that they are gay or lesbian and live with it for a long time before they find the confidence and courage to start telling people about that defining part of their identity. They might pretend to be heterosexual for a long time, simply because of the fear of discrimination. Homophobia, as with all forms of hate crime, is incredibly unfair. It accuses a person of wrongdoing for simply being themselves and being true to their thoughts, their feelings, and their conscience, when there is absolutely no wrong and no harm in not being heterosexual. Targeting someone for a defining characteristic is a pure form of hatred, and by equal measure, a pure form of ignorance too. The LGBTQ+ community has long had to battle against the prejudice surrounding alternative identity that doesn't conform to simple binary options of men and women who are attracted to each other. The idea of this community having to fight just to have a fair space in which it can exist, only as they are and without having to pretend to be something that they're not, is fundamentally at the heart of this issue of hate crime. The issue of transgender rights is considered to be the hottest and most recent topic in the whole debate. People are still strongly divided about this issue, and it is still described openly in mainstream social media platforms as being a mental illness. A number of high-profile social media users have actually been banned from platforms because their position on anti-trans rights is so aggressive. What is very clear about the issue of trans rights, though, is that it's following the pattern that we've observed on the issues of racial equality, of gender equality, and of gay and lesbian rights too. To begin with, the issue is always up for debate, and people seem to occupy one camp or another, supporting the rights or not. Invariably, however, over time, the right that a person has to exist simply as they are is seen to prevail, and it is people who would restrict such rights that over time come to be viewed as oppressive and wrong. As with all of the equality movements, trans rights has been smeared with ignorant tropes. A trope is a reoccurring argument or a depiction that illustrates a certain group in a particular way. Racial tropes at one time depicted black men as physically strong but mentally inferior. A trope about Jewish people offensively suggested that all Jewish people are greedy for money. Gay people have been smeared with the suggestion that their sexuality is connected to paedophilia and child abuse. Disability tropes include the suggestion that they're cynical and lazy and a burden on society. A very prominent trans trope is that they seek to undermine female identity and feminism for attention-seeking purposes, and that trans people want to gain access to public toilets in order to commit offences and crimes. The thing about a trope is that it doesn't stand up to close examination or scrutiny. For example, traditional Jews commonly practice Masar Kesefim, donating 10% of their income to support people in need. The ridiculous suggestion of black men being mentally inferior to white men has been countered by several generations of outstanding black thinkers, such as Barack Obama, Dr. Martin Luther King, and amazing writers like Langston Hughes and Chinua Achebe. As with all tropes, the slurs that have been placed against the trans community are without foundation, and since the increase in prominence of the trans rights movement, there has of course been no discernible increase in offences committed in public restrooms. Hate crime incidents against people on the basis of race and religion, and specifically since the so-called War on Terror began with the World Trade Center atrocity on the 11th of September 2001, we've definitely seen certain communities from the Middle East, from Pakistan, from Asia, India, Afghanistan and North Africa targeted. The Islamic faith and Muslim communities broadly have faced particular levels of hostility and ignorance. The murder of Jo Cox MP on the 16th of June 2016 is an example of just how severe and how awful hate crime can be. Jo Cox was murdered because of her inclusive and supportive attitude towards Islamic communities and countries in the Middle East. Jo Cox was an MP in the constituency of Batley and Spen. She was a politician who was recognised to embrace diversity, and she unified a majority vote in her local constituency by seeking to represent people across a full spectrum of different backgrounds, which included white, Indian and Pakistani families. She also did work for Oxfam, travelling to help people in Afghanistan directly. During the EU referendum, Jo Cox campaigned publicly against leaving the EU and has been remembered for her quote, "We have far more in common than that which divides us." On the 16th of June 2016, Jo Cox became a lightning rod for all the hatred and fear that was surrounding a particularly vitriolic and bigoted debate. This was a type of politics that divided people in the most fundamental ways and set people against each other in a terrible and oppositional manner. The person who murdered Jo Cox attacked her in the street at 12:53 p.m. on the 16th of June. She was shot 3 times with a sawn-off .22 hunting rifle. Witnesses to this horrific incident have reported that they heard the offender shouting, "This is for Britain," and "Britain first." The fury of the attack was such that a 77-year-old man rushing to the aid of Jo Cox was also stabbed by the offender. When he was placed on trial, the murderer of Jo Cox responded to the court when they asked him for his name: "Death to traitors, freedom for Britain." Although he was referred for psychiatric evaluation, it was found that he wasn't operating under any psychiatric impairment and was held fully responsible for his offences. The life of Jo Cox was stolen from a husband and 2 children due to a despicable and an evil act. She was a public servant and she provided an enormous service in uniting a community against racism and hatred. I've made a deliberate choice not to name the man who committed this crime, as I do not believe that he deserves to be remembered or given any form of notoriety for what he did. People who are found guilty of committing crimes on the basis of hatred are subject to far stiffer consequences in court. Hate crime matters are routinely, and as a matter of process, evaluated by the Crown Prosecution Service. And they're far more likely to result in custodial sentences. That is, the offender is far more likely to go to prison. Every generation has its own responsibility to uphold the progress that is being made against hatred, and in turn to push humanity forward, where open tolerance and compassion overcomes the issues of prejudice and discrimination. Remember, hate crime is defined as an offence which is motivated by a hostility towards, or a perceived hostility towards, these characteristics: disability, race, religion, sexuality and/or gender, and specifically transgender. I hope this video has helped you to understand hate crime in more detail. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.